This is New England Public Media News. I'm Kari Njiiri. Question 1 is a proposed constitutional amendment on Massachusetts ballots that would establish an additional 4% state income tax on annual taxable income over $1 million, with the income level adjusted annually to reflect increases in the cost of living. Revenue from this tax would be dedicated for public education and transportation, subject to the legislature's appropriation of that money. We're now joined by a supporter of the question and an opponent for a short debate. Andrew Farnitano is a spokesperson for Fair Share Massachusetts, a group urging a yes vote. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you.
And Dan Cense is a spokesperson for the Coalition to Stop the Tax Hike Amendment, which wants Massachusetts residents to vote no. And thanks for joining us, Dan.
Thank you, Kari. Happy to be here.
So we flipped a coin, and Dan will get the first question. And just again, we want to cover a lot of ground, so please keep your answers brief. Dan, you claim question 1 nearly doubles the state income tax rate on tens of thousands of small business owners and family farmers, homeowners, and retirees. But we should be clear, a taxpayer's first million in income is taxed at the lower 5% rate. It's only income above that is subject to the 9% rate. Why shouldn't people with means pay a larger share to support crucial services, like at the federal level?
Thank you. I appreciate the question. Uber wealthy people and people with great means most likely will not be tremendously affected by this, Kari. What we're here today to talk about is the middle class of Massachusetts who perhaps would only be affected by this tax one time in their life. When they sell a home, sell a small business, sell a farm, or have some event in their life whereby they would enter into this tax bracket one time and then prepare to retire or pass that money down to their children. And we feel it's unfair for them to pay a significant increase, 80% if you calculate it, that one time that they enter into this classification.
Andrew, you say the current tax rules allow multimillionaires to pay a smaller share in taxes than the rest of us. And so the rich should pay their fair share of taxes. But why won't wealthy people move to states like New Hampshire and Florida that don't tax regular income? And Massachusetts would lose all their tax dollars.
Kari, thank you. If the billionaires and multimillionaires were able to avoid this tax so easily, they wouldn't be spending millions and millions of dollars trying to fight it on the ballot. They are funding a multi-million-dollar campaign to convince voters to vote no with lies about how this would affect homes. There's been a ton of research on this issue. Less than 1% of homes in the state sell for enough of a gain to be affected by question 1. Only 7 homes in Western Mass, all of Western Mass last year, sold for enough to generate a capital gain of over $1 million. So what Dan said about the middle class is just not true. Middle class people will not be affected, whether they're retirees, home sellers, or small business owners. This tax will only affect those at the very, very top, the top 1% of income earners. And they are fighting hard to convince voters to vote no, because they know that they will pay more when we pass this in November.
Andrew, the argument is that this money will go towards public education and transportation, but there's no guarantee that the legislature won't just use it to displace current funding. So shouldn't voters be suspicious of the promise of additional funding for these services?
Thanks. Let's be clear about what question 1 does. So question 1 raises this tax on income over $1 million and constitutionally dedicates the funding to education and transportation. It's not just a regular law or a regular ballot question. It will put that legal restriction in the text of the Constitution that the money raised must be spent on education and transportation. That is stronger than any other possible thing we could do to ensure that more money goes to education and transportation. It's the strongest possible legal requirement. We've got a coalition of more than 500 organizations across the state, teachers and healthcare workers and small business owners, who are going to stick around after Election Day to make sure that the money is additional money that reaches our local schools and our local roads and bridges. Attorney General Maura Healey has reaffirmed that she thinks the money will be additive on top of what's being spent today. And we wouldn't be fighting so hard to pass this if we didn't believe that the money will go to roads and schools and public transportation. The need is so great. There are so many crumbling bridges across the state, more than 200 in Western Mass that are structurally deficient and in need of repair. Our public school students are seeing test scores that have dropped down to a level we haven't seen since the early 90s. We need more resources in our schools and our transportation system to build a better economy that works for everyone, and question one will allow us to do that.
Dan, Massachusetts has had a big surplus in recent years and high tax revenues and billions in federal relief money, part of that surplus. But there were many years when that was not the case, and the Baker administration has said it does expect revenues to drop as this fiscal year continues. Why shouldn't the state set itself up for long-term stability to pay for necessary programs?
Well, Kari, the state should set itself up for long-term stability, but the funds generated from this tend to be more in capital gains and things that fluctuate much greater when the economy is going well. There's been studies that show that this could fluctuate anywhere from 900 million to 1.2 billion to 2 billion. And the bottom line is that it's not going to be a consistent revenue source. So it's not something that you can plan on. And we do have a massive surplus. We have $8 billion in our stabilization fund, the largest in the history of the state. We have $10 billion in funds coming down from the federal government to help with our roads and bridges in the infrastructure bill. We're giving back $2.94 billion in overpaid taxes to the taxpayers of Massachusetts because of the economy and where it stands today. And finally, these monies, as you've said before, aren't guaranteed to increase education or transportation funding. Members of the legislature were asked by the Boston Globe recently, and their response was there is no guarantee that this will increase. So we don't know where it's going necessarily at the end of the day. We don't know how much it's going to be, and we don't need it right now.
Dan, and this is the last question. A Tufts analysis found that as few as 0.6% of households will pay more because of this tax. Still, your campaign is focusing on small business owners when your top contributors are huge businesses, financial firms, and CEOs, people who have a lot to lose if this passes. How does this reality match the talking points?
Well, the reality is we represent an organization of over 1,000 individuals and businesses that have signed up that represent over 25,000 companies in Massachusetts and hundreds of thousands of employees who've read the language, who understand where it is, and who stand together to say this will harm them, small businesses and large businesses alike. The Boston Chamber of Commerce, the Cambridge Chamber of Commerce, the Mass Retailers Association, the Western Massachusetts Economic Development Council, the Massachusetts Farm Bureau, Kari, all stand with us in opposition of question one.
Andrew, one main argument against this has to do with taxpayers whose income usually never approaches $1 million, but when they sell their business or property or looking to retirement, perhaps they'll get hit with a huge tax bill. Why should those taxpayers be treated the same as people making millions every year?
If someone makes less than $1 million most of the time, and 1 year they make a little bit over $1 million, they'll pay a little bit more. Someone who makes $1.1 million, a huge amount of money, would pay an extra $4,000. 70% of the money raised by this tax is coming from people who make over $5 million, the richest, wealthiest people in our state, the people who are spending money to oppose this. They know what's at stake. We know that they can afford to pay a little bit more to invest in our schools and our roads and our bridges.
Okay, so we're almost out of time here, but I'm going to ask this. So, closing arguments here. And since Dan went first, we'll begin with very brief 30-second closing arguments with Andrew.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. This is an important opportunity for Massachusetts. We have a chance to deliver long-term sustainable funding for our public schools, to get them back on track and help students out, to fix our roads and bridges, invest in clean transportation across the state. We can do it without asking middle-class families to pay a single penny more. Only less than 1% of the richest people in our state who haven't been paying their fair share in the past, they can afford to pay a little bit more so that we can make these investments.
Thank you, sir. And Dan, your closing argument.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kari. Thank you, Andrew, for being a part of this debate today. The truth of the matter is we should invest in roads and bridges. We should fund our education levels to the highest point possible. Unfortunately, this ballot measure and ultimate constitutional amendment and change to our Constitution does not guarantee any of that. What it does guarantee is that 50% of the people affected by it, captured by this tax each year, it'll be the only time in their lives that they have to pay it. These aren't multimillionaires. These aren't uber wealthy people. These are farmers in Western Massachusetts. These are small business owners trying to make their way out of COVID, trying to make their way in an inflationary market and a situation where we have a worker shortage. These are small businesses that work their entire lives to then sell that business at the end of their career and retire upon that money. We don't think that it's right to do so. We ask you to vote no on question 1.
Thank you, gentlemen. Andrew Farnitano, spokesperson for Fair Share Massachusetts, and Dan Cense for the Coalition to Stop the Tax Hike Amendment. Thank you to you both.
Thank you.
And you can find much more coverage of Election 22 on our website, nepm.org. This is New England Public Media.